Few games have been as divisive as Days Gone in recent years. While The Last of Us Part 2 certainly takes the cake in that regard for 2020, 2019, however, was colored in large part by the game Days Gone, and how opinions on the game seem to have quite a gulf between them. While major gaming review outlets were giving Sony Bend's newest game 6s and 7s and the occasional 8, many fans of the game expressed dissatisfaction with that sentiment and praised the game's massive world, motorcycles, stuff, and even the story as one of PS4's best up to that point. This brings up a few interesting questions. Why is there sometimes such a massive gap between mainstream game reviewers and gamers themselves? How should we be critiquing games in the first place? And, more importantly, is Days Gone a hidden gem? First and foremost, I think it's important to remember that while a professional reviewer that has the job of critiquing a game is going to sometimes come to different conclusions than the average gamer who is just looking for a way to kill 20 hours or so, in the case of Days Gone, many of the most predominant opinions really weren't that far apart. While those who loved the game were generally willing to admit Days Gone fell short in a few spots, most mainstream reviewers also weren't shy about praising areas that the game got right, like the graphics, general gameplay, and filling the world well with things to do. Going from an 8 to a 6, two scores that ultimately mean above average, is pretty much up to personal taste. One guy might be in the mood for their 200th zombie game, while the next might roll their eyes at it. Both opinions are valid, since they are just that, opinions. However, it is also true that many perceive a score of anything below 8 to be trash, despite how silly that is. Because of that snap judgment though, unremarkable scores can have the unintentional side effect of relegating a game's reputation to the sidelines. Days Gone certainly fell victim to that in a way. Despite being a very profitable game, it does seem like Days Gone was passed over by many due to its surface-level reputation being not amazing. But less than amazing doesn't mean bad, so whether Days Gone's bad reputation is the fault of those who scored it or those who fundamentally misunderstood the scores is hard to say, but all we can do now is look back on it as clearly and fairly as possible. As I sort of touched on earlier, Days Gone is roughly the 200th zombie game you've seen on the shelves this generation. Of course, I exaggerate, but the truth is, it's hard to think of a more overly saturated genre that's been pulled in so many different directions and beaten like a dead horse so thoroughly for so long. Even back in 2014, when development of Days Gone likely began, Sony Bend must have known what they were getting into by making an open-world zombie game, and knew that in order to stand out, some serious outside-of-the-box thinking would have to be employed. Trouble is, Sony Bend did very little of that. Days Gone plays it painfully safe, with a painfully overdone motif, and even manages to somehow get some things painfully wrong in the process. A mostly serviceable yet still fairly two-dimensional cast of main characters goes through a mostly serviceable yet still fairly predictable story, all while occasionally getting sidetracked by very open-worldy things that you've seen many times before. Days Gone's characters rarely evolve or change in any meaningful way, and some of the writing, line delivery, and overall tone of certain moments just feels very uninterested in itself. Deacon exists. Sarah is his motivation, and Boozer is a person who also exists. Ultimately, Days Gone's sin is its desire to be something that it doesn't really seem willing to do the hard work required to become. That doesn't make it a bad game, but that lack of special sauce is something that professional reviewers can smell from a mile away, and that is probably why it had a hard time truly impressing most of them, as well as plenty of gamers who bought it expecting a story on par with other first-party PlayStation games. All of that being said, as somebody who started off as a doubter, but ultimately finished the game, I would be lying if I said I didn't really enjoy much of my playthrough once I realized what I was playing. Days Gone might have bitten off more than it could chew with trying to have a satisfying story and great characters, but once I was able to let go of that expectation, I gotta say, it clicked for me. Now, I don't say that to mean that I suddenly realized how undeniably great it was, but rather I just finally understood what its strengths were. The meat of Days Gone is a fairly grindy collect-a-thon action game. While it is true that you need to tolerate a boilerplate story with boilerplate characters and some wonky gameplay to get to that meat, once you do get there, it can be absolutely worth it if you enjoy that flavor of game. It's like a reverse Trojan horse. If you can tolerate the drab exterior, it can be quite addicting once you can fully appreciate what's inside. Collecting resources, scrap, freaker bounties, and building up your reputation with various camps gives you access to better upgrades for your motorcycle and weapons, which in turn gives you a steady, albeit extremely slow, sense of advancement that rewards your patience with small drips of progression. As you get better at the game and more equipped for the threats of its world, taking on the game's iconic freaker hordes becomes less of a daunting burden and more of a realistic goal. You may even be able to take out one of the game's smaller hordes before you know it. However, like most of the best parts of Days Gone, you don't really get to experience it until you're many hours in, which is unfortunate. But if you stick with it and get to that point where you can take them on, you can really see what Days Gone is all about. Positioning your bike on a hilltop overseeing the horde in a way that will make escape easier, planting explosives around their perimeter, formulating the path you want to take, maybe even picking off a few of them from a distance before things get messy, are all things to consider and all make every encounter with a horde just a little bit different. These massive battles can go on for some time, they can ruin your plans, and they are easily the most fun part of the game. Whether or not they are worth putting up with Days Gone's quirks and missteps will depend on the player, but those moments of fun are undeniably there. Even the story does a bit better by the end, as certain overarching plot threads start to tie up. And while I still wouldn't call the story great, I was glad to see that it does end on a far better note than it begins. So, I suppose Days Gone isn't quite what I would call a hidden gem. It's neither a gem nor hidden. It had obvious flaws that warranted criticism, and it wasn't exactly unknown. It had every chance it needed to get some fundamental things right, that it just plain didn't in many cases. It hides its best features under too much mediocre story, wobbly combat, and a progression system that takes too long to feel like a progression system. But once you make it over that hill, there is a series of addictive gameplay loops and a few surprises on the other side that can and will absolutely make the journey worth it for the right players. It's a game that gets some things really right and it gets some things really wrong. Depending on which one of those things matter to you will largely color your overall opinion of the game. As a result, I don't think giving Days Gone a 6, 7, or an 8 are unreasonable scores, as the game is clearly above average and also clearly fundamentally flawed. These are not mutually exclusive concepts. Days Gone is more than a number though. So, if it seems like something you would enjoy, it probably is. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.